The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents, Why Isn't All This Easier? So I recently got an email that I thought would be very good for the Atheist Debates Project because it gives me the opportunity to both point out good thinking and potentially flawed thinking and prepare people for the traps that they might have to deal with. And so I thought what I'd do is read you the email and then go through it point by point to kind of give my thoughts and pointers on this. It starts off and it says, "Hi there. I've been wading through YouTube clips of your show and many others in the Hitch, Dawkins, Harris realm, and I'm often frustrated by the extended complexity of the arguments. I'm curious if you can recall and refer me to one of your archived shows where the argument took place based on simple logic, something perhaps like this. We now understand epilepsy. In the Bible, a seizure was considered to be demonic possession, nothing supernatural involved. We now understand that every 7 years, locusts overrun certain areas. In the Bible, it was considered a plague, nothing supernatural involved. We now understand that small animals can be swept up in storms so that it seems like it is raining frogs. In the Bible, it was considered a plague, nothing supernatural involved. We now understand eclipses. In the Bible, it was a sign or a curse from God, nothing supernatural involved. Things were often misunderstood in those times, and we now know the truth. So why do you believe the same book when it says a guy rose from the dead?" Let's take a look at that. So first of all, I'd like to point out that this is the way a lot of people think about these things. This is the way a lot of this is viewed, and it's not ridiculous. It's not entirely unreasonable. It is more of an intuitive type of argument that, we've seen in modern times people attempting to exorcise demons from somebody when all of the best evidence points to the conclusion that they are suffering from some mental illness and need psychological counseling and perhaps medication. The problem here is, first of all, if you say nothing supernatural involved, you're making a claim that there's not some supernatural component. And I will always caution against that. You're probably right. It seems to be kind of the way we should look at things. But it's more accurate to say there's no reason to think this is anything other than natural. If you have a reason, if you have a justification for claiming that this is a supernatural thing, you would need to present that. Until then, we're going to stick with, all right, we're going to work with the natural until somebody can demonstrate the supernatural. And I've done an entire video on supernatural causation, how it may be ultimately untestable, unprovable, unfalsifiable, etc. But when we look at something like, we now understand epilepsy, yes, we do, but we don't understand it completely. And also the stories in the Bible that you are interpreting as epilepsy, how do you know that that's what it was? This is something you can't really investigate. You can't really do patient diagnosis in an archaeological sense of, this was reported back in history. We engage in this on occasion. We say, these stories here, they are typical of what somebody with schizophrenia might experience, or the actions of this person. It's very likely that this ancient president that we don't have any medical records for was megalomaniacal, was somewhere on the spectrum, probably had a kidney problem or an issue with their pancreas or stuff. You can make kind of armchair diagnoses like that. But it would be a mistake to say, here's a story in the Bible. To me, this sounds like epilepsy. Maybe even to some medical experts, it sounds like epilepsy. And so we're just going to call it epilepsy, and that is how we're going to dismiss all the claims in the Bible. There's a problem with doing that, and that is that you can't demonstrate that your answer is the best one. However, that actually works in your favor, because they can't demonstrate that their explanation is the best one either. And in fact, of the two explanations, one being this is likely epilepsy, and the other being, this is a demon, one of them actually has supporting evidence and is in fact reasonable, and the other one doesn't have supporting evidence. That's the demon one that doesn't have supporting evidence, just in case that wasn't clear. The next one was, we now understand that every 7 years, locusts overrun certain areas. That's true. There's different time periods. There's 7 year, I think there's 13 year, maybe 21 year or something like that. But it's not necessarily the same ones. However, the important thing is that the description of what happens in the Bible isn't the same as what we see every 7 years. There's a whole bunch of locusts. This was a plague, and he notes that it was described as a plague. This was reported as a plague that completely destroyed crops. The fact that there are natural biorhythms to cicada and locust doesn't mean that what we see every 7 years remotely counts as a plague. It's just a resurgence in a higher population. They become more noticeable. Yes, you can have localized plagues, completely absent this notion of a 7-year cycle. You could have your entire crops destroyed for a year, and it might have nothing to do with the rhythms. So basically the argument that he's trying to make is, hey, we know these things die off and then they come back, and we know that they do this on a rhythm. My point here is that the two aren't necessarily connected. That even in that rhythmic cycle, that doesn't mean that you're going to get something that is plague-like that would destroy crops and be a problem. And outside of that cycle, that can also happen. The danger here for all of these is that you are claiming to have an explanation for something in the Bible, an explanation that is utterly natural, and you're reaching that explanation based on insufficient information. Because we don't actually know what happened. Was it a plague? Were all the crops destroyed? Or is this some hyperbole? Or is this just a fictional story? Is it a metaphor? Is it allegory for something? The knowing that small animals can get swept in a storm so it seems like it's raining frogs. Yeah, we know that stuff happens. The point is, how do you know that that is the best explanation for what's in there when you don't even know what's in the book? This is the thing that I kind of caution about. Yes, we have a better understanding of eclipses, of animal populations, of what kind of weird things can happen because we have more information. We have a better ability to explore and investigate. However, all of those things that he points out could be wrong, and it still might be the case that somebody rose from the dead. So to take a list of 10 things and say, 8 of these are wrong, there's no reason for me to believe the 9th one. That is the sort of intuitive process that we go through about determining whether or not a source should be considered reliable. But whether or not the source is reliable is independent from whether or not it's accurate. So if I list 10 things and 8 of them are wrong, I'm not very reliable, but number 9 and number 10 could be completely accurate. Each statement needs to be judged independently. Yes, you do get to consider the source. We absolutely should consider the reliability of the source, because that is what allows us to determine how much effort we might want to put into exploring and investigating the claims of this. You know, if you've got somebody who is lying to you all the time, when they tell you that, hey, they've got a Komodo dragon in their backyard that can breathe fire, it's probably not worth investigating if they're generally unreliable. So there's value in determining that the Bible seems to be unreliable. But the problem here gets compounded because there are slight mistakes in the assessment of each of these things as not supernatural. We don't have enough information. We have a story. We're not sure if the story is necessarily meant to be literal. We don't know how much hyperbole is involved. We have no way of investigating it. And I would fully agree that all of these proposed explanations from the gentleman who emailed are seemingly reasonable assessments of the sort of claims that we have. And for most people, that's probably going to be good enough. But the reason I exercise a little caution here is because if you are in a debate, we've talked before about making claims and establishing the burden of proof. And if somebody comes up and says, well, what about this story in the Bible? And you say, oh, that was just, the natural 7-year rhythm of locusts. We already know about this. Really? Then why is it 7 years we don't have a plague that destroys crops and, they're so thick that you can't breathe and can't see? Well, now you have to say, oh, well, that part of the story I'm rejecting as hyperbole. And you could do that, and it would be an honest discussion. But that doesn't mean you're justified in doing it. And so the better course of action, in my estimation, is to say, I have no reason to believe that the story is true and accurate. There are a number of potential explanations for that, including it was a plague from God being a potential one. So I have to look at all the possible explanations and say, which one's more reasonable? Which one is most reasonable? And among the possible explanations, going from God did it, which is way out here with essentially no supporting evidence, and then you have other supernatural explanations that perhaps aren't provable and can't have supporting evidence. And then you move into the proposed natural explanations. And among the proposed natural explanations has to be, this story simply isn't accurate. And at the end of the day, there's another answer way out on this end, which is, I would argue, the default starting position, which is, I don't know. And there's nothing wrong with being in that position, because if the correct position, if the correct answer is, I don't know what the explanation is for this, you are still putting the burden of proof where it belongs. The people who think that they do know what the explanation is, the people who think that that their God proposal is the best explanation, they maintain the burden of proof. They have to demonstrate that they're right. I love to keep the burden of proof there, because what ends up happening is people get frustrated. Well, you atheists, you just don't say anything. You won't make any sort of explanation at all. Well, at least I have an explanation. Yeah, but I'm not concerned so much with whether or not I have an explanation. I'm concerned with whether or not I'm accepting the correct explanation. I mean, you can run around saying, well, we didn't have any better explanation, so I went with pixies. And it doesn't tell me whether or not you're right, but it does tell me whether or not you're a skeptic, whether or not you are engaged in critical thinking, whether or not you are engaging the world in a reasonable fashion. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.